The sun cast long shadows across the well-manicured lawns of Pine Valley, a suburban neighborhood just outside Boston, where perfectly trimmed hedges and freshly painted mailboxes lined every street. Among these picturesque homes stood the Wilson family's two-story colonial, where life was about to change in ways no one could have predicted. Michelle, a sophomore at Boston University, had always been the perfect daughter in her father's eyes. With her long brown hair, bright eyes, and a smile that could light up any room, she carried herself with a quiet confidence that made her stand out among her peers. But it wasn't just her appearance that made her father, David, proud. It was her dedication to her studies, her role as captain of the debate team, and her unwavering commitment to their family's values. David Wilson wasn't just any father in the neighborhood. He was someone everyone knew. As the principal of Pine Valley High School for the past 15 years, he had built a reputation as a strict disciplinarian who believed in traditional values. His wife, Anne, had learned to navigate his strong personalities over their 20 years of marriage, often acting as a bridge between his rigid worldview and their changing society. That autumn evening, as leaves danced across their driveway, Michelle sat at her desk in her dorm room, her heart racing as she composed a text message. On the other side of campus, in the university library, sat Anthony, a junior pre-med student whose academic achievements had earned him a full scholarship. Their story had begun 3 months earlier during a late-night study session for organic chemistry. It wasn't just Anthony's intelligence that had caught Michelle's attention, it was his kindness. She remembered how he had stayed behind to help another student understand a complex concept, breaking it down with patience and humor. His warm brown eyes crinkled at the corners when he smiled, and his quiet confidence reminded her of her father, though they couldn't have been more different in other ways. Their first conversation had started over shared frustration with molecular structures, but it quickly evolved into discussions about their dreams, fears, and hopes for the future. Anthony spoke about his desire to become a pediatric surgeon, inspired by the doctor who had saved his younger brother's life years ago. Michelle shared her passion for environmental law and her dream of making a difference in climate policy. As weeks turned into months, their study sessions became coffee dates, and coffee dates turned into long walks around campus. Michelle found herself falling for Anthony in ways she had never experienced before. He challenged her thinking, made her laugh, and most importantly, saw her for who she was, not just as the principal's daughter. But with each passing day, a knot of anxiety grew in her stomach. She knew her father's views all too well. She had heard them at dinner tables, family gatherings, and community events. David Wilson's world was black and white, with no room for the beautiful shades of gray that Michelle was discovering in her life at university. Her mother, Anne, had noticed the change in her daughter during weekend visits home. The way Michelle's phone would light up with texts that made her smile, how she seemed more distant during family dinners, lost in thought. One evening, as they washed dishes together, Anne had gently asked about the special someone who was clearly making her daughter so happy. Michelle had broken down then, tears mixing with the dishwater as she confided in her mother about Anthony, about his brilliance, his kindness, and her fear of her father's reaction. Anne had hugged her daughter tight, her own heart heavy with the weight of knowing what lay ahead. She promised to support Michelle, but warned her that the path she had chosen wouldn't be easy. As autumn deepened into winter, Michelle and Anthony's relationship grew stronger in the safety of campus life. They found joy in simple moments, studying together in quiet corners of the library, sharing hot chocolate on cold afternoons, and dreaming about their futures. But with each passing day, Michelle knew they were living on borrowed time. The weight of her secret grew heavier, especially when Anthony would talk about meeting her family, about doing things the right way. What neither of them knew was that their carefully constructed world was about to collide with reality in the most unexpected way. David Wilson, always the organized planner, was about to pay a surprise visit to campus, carrying his daughter's forgotten laptop that she needed for an important presentation. The simple act of a father helping his daughter would set in motion events that would challenge everything everyone thought they knew about love, family, and the capacity for change. Little did any of them know that the next few hours would change their lives forever, testing bonds, beliefs, and the true meaning of family in ways none of them could have imagined. Winter had settled over Boston, coating the university campus in a blanket of pristine snow. For Michelle and Anthony, their relationship had blossomed into something beautiful, yet the weight of secrecy was beginning to take its toll. Every weekend visit home became an elaborate performance for Michelle, each family dinner a careful dance of half-truths that left a bitter taste in her mouth. Anne watched her daughter's internal struggle with growing concern. During their private moments together, like their Sunday morning baking sessions, she noticed how Michelle's bright personality seemed dimmed by the strain of hiding such an important part of her life. The kitchen would fill with the warm scent of chocolate chip cookies as Michelle confided in her mother about the latest developments in her relationship. "He surprised me with coffee and my favorite muffin before my big presentation," Michelle would say, her eyes lighting up before quickly dimming again. I wish I could just bring him home for dinner, like my friends do with their boyfriends." Anne would squeeze her daughter's hand, understanding the complexity of their situation all too well. She had seen glimpses of Anthony through Michelle's phone pictures, his kind eyes and warm smile, the way he looked at her daughter as if she hung the moon. But she also knew her husband, knew how years of ingrained prejudices had hardened his heart against the very possibility of such a relationship. The tension in the Wilson household grew more palpable with each passing week. David noticed the changes in his daughter, her increasing absences from family events, the way she guarded her phone, her vague answers about her social life at university. He attributed it to the natural progression of college life, but something nagged at him, a father's intuition that there was more to the story. One evening, during their traditional Friday family dinner, Michelle's younger sister Katie innocently mentioned seeing a photo of Michelle with some guy on her friend's social media. The dining room fell silent, the only sound the gentle clink of forks against plates. David's questioning gaze bore into Michelle, who quickly dismissed it as just a study partner. Later that night, Anne found Michelle crying in her old bedroom. "I hate lying to him," Michelle whispered, hugging her childhood teddy bear. "But I'm more afraid of telling him the truth." Anne sat with her daughter, stroking her hair like she used to when Michelle was small, wishing she could shield her from the storm that was surely coming. Back at university, Anthony was facing his own struggles. His roommate Michael had become a confidant and supporter, watching as his friend navigated this complicated relationship. "You deserve better than being someone's secret," Michael would say during their late-night talks. But Anthony's response was always the same. "She's worth waiting for. We just need time to figure this out." Their stolen moments together became more precious. They found sanctuary in quiet corners of the campus, the back table at the coffee shop where they first studied together, the bench under the old oak tree where they shared their first kiss, the empty classroom where they would meet between lectures just to see each other's faces. Anthony started leaving little notes in Michelle's textbooks, encouraging words before a big test, silly jokes to make her smile, promises of a future where they wouldn't have to hide. Michelle kept each one, tucked away in a small box beneath her dorm room bed, physical reminders that their love was real, despite the secrecy. The pressure began showing in small ways. Michelle started missing family events more frequently, claiming study groups and project meetings. Her father's birthday dinner was the first major family occasion she had ever missed, choosing instead to celebrate Anthony's acceptance into a prestigious medical program. The guilt ate at her, but the joy of being able to openly celebrate with Anthony, even if just for one evening, felt like breathing fresh air after being underwater. Anne covered for her daughter as best she could, but she knew David was growing suspicious. He would make comments about how university was changing Michelle, how she seemed to be drifting away from their family values. During these moments, Anne would catch Katie's knowing glances. At 13, her younger daughter was more perceptive than anyone gave her credit for. As winter began to thaw into spring, Michelle and Anthony's relationship deepened. They started talking about the future, about residency programs and law schools, about dreams of a life together. But with each plan they made, the reality of their situation cast long shadows over their hopes. The breaking point came during a video call with Anthony's family. His mother, a warm-hearted woman who had raised 3 children on her own while working 2 jobs, asked when she would finally get to meet Michelle's family. The pain in Anthony's eyes as he made excuses was almost too much for Michelle to bear. That night, as Michelle lay in her dorm room staring at the ceiling, she made a decision. The next family dinner, she would tell her father the truth. She texted her mother to prepare her for what was coming, and then called Anthony to share her plans. Neither of them could have known that fate had other ideas, that David Wilson's surprise visit with a forgotten laptop would bring their careful world crashing down before Michelle could find the right words to build a bridge between the two parts of her life. The stage was set for a confrontation that would test the bonds of family, the strength of love, and the possibility of change in ways that would leave no one untouched. The morning started like any other Tuesday on campus. Students hurried across the frost-covered quad, coffee cups clutched in gloved hands, breath visible in the crisp March air. Michelle had been up late finishing a paper, and in her rush to get to her morning class, she'd forgotten her laptop at home during the weekend visit. She wasn't worried, though. She had her notes printed out and figured she could borrow a classmate's computer if needed. What she didn't know was that her father had noticed the laptop sitting on her desk that morning. David Wilson, always the caring father despite his rigid ways, decided to surprise his daughter by dropping it off at her dorm. He'd left work early, telling his secretary he had a family matter to attend to. The laptop was tucked carefully in its case, along with some of Michelle's favorite homemade cookies that Anne had sent along. The timing couldn't have been worse. Anthony had just finished his afternoon lab session and had stopped by Michelle's dorm to share some exciting news. He'd been selected for a prestigious summer research program. They'd been celebrating in her room, sharing dreams about the future, when Anthony decided to head out to his next class. The hallway was quiet, most students either in class or at the library. The sound of the elevator door opening echoed through the corridor just as Anthony stepped out of Michelle's room. David Wilson, carrying his daughter's laptop bag, stepped out at the exact moment Anthony was pulling the door closed behind him. Time seemed to freeze. David's eyes moved from Anthony's face to his hand on Michelle's doorknob, and in that split second, the careful world his daughter had built began to crumble. The laptop bag slipped from David's grasp, hitting the floor with a dull thud that seemed to echo through the silent hallway. "Sir," Anthony started to say, recognizing Michelle's father from the family photos she'd shown him. He took a step forward, extending his hand in greeting, trying to handle the situation with the respect and dignity it deserved. But David wasn't seeing the accomplished student before him, the young man with dreams of healing others. He wasn't seeing the person who made his daughter's eyes light up, who had spent countless hours helping other students understand difficult concepts, who volunteered at the Children's Hospital every weekend. All he saw was his worst fears materialized, standing in front of his daughter's door. Michelle, hearing the commotion, appeared in the doorway. The color drained from her face as she took in the scene, her father's rigid stance, Anthony's outstretched hand, the fallen laptop bag between them. "Dad," she said, her voice barely a whisper, "I can explain." But before she could say another word, David's hand moved in an arc through the air. The sound of the slap echoed through the hallway like a gunshot, followed by a collective gasp from students who had begun to gather, drawn by the tension in the air. Anthony stumbled backward, more from shock than the force of the blow. His hand went to his cheek, his eyes wide with disbelief. Michelle screamed, pushing past him to stand between her father and boyfriend, her arms spread wide as if she could somehow shield Anthony from more than just physical blows. "What is wrong with you?" she shouted at her father, tears streaming down her face. "He's done nothing wrong." Nothing. A small crowd had gathered now, phones raised, capturing the moment that would soon spiral far beyond their little hallway. One student was already on the phone with campus security, speaking in hushed, urgent tones. David stood there, his hand still raised, as if he too was shocked by what he'd done. In his daughter's eyes, he saw something he'd never seen before, not just anger or disappointment, but fear. His little girl was looking at him the way she used to look at thunderstorms when she was small, and the realization hit him like a physical blow. "Mr. Wilson," Anthony's voice was steady, though his cheek was reddening where David's hand had struck. "I care about your daughter. I would never." "Don't." David's voice was like ice. "Don't you dare speak about my daughter." His hands were shaking now, his world tilting on its axis. Everything he thought he knew, everything he believed about protecting his family, seemed to be crumbling around him. Campus security arrived then, their presence bringing a temporary pause to the tension. The officer in charge, a middle-aged woman with kind eyes and a no-nonsense demeanor, quickly assessed the situation. "Sir," she addressed David, "I'm going to have to ask you to come with me." Michelle reached for Anthony's hand, gripping it tightly, publicly acknowledging their relationship for the first time in front of her father. The look of betrayal on David's face would haunt her for months to come. As security led David away, he looked back over his shoulder at his daughter. Michelle stood tall, her hands still firmly clasped in Anthony's, tears streaming down her face, but her chin raised in defiance. In that moment, David saw not just his daughter, but a young woman standing up for what she believed in, for who she loved. And somewhere, in a part of his heart he didn't want to acknowledge, a small seed of doubt about everything he'd ever believed began to take root. The hallway slowly emptied, but the ripples from those few violent seconds would continue to spread, touching lives far beyond their small circle, challenging long-held beliefs, and forcing everyone involved to confront truths they'd tried to ignore. As Michelle and Anthony held each other, both shaking from the encounter, neither could have known that this moment of crisis would become the catalyst for profound change in both their families' lives. News travels fast on a college campus, but in the age of social media, it travels at the speed of light. By nightfall, shaky cell phone videos of the confrontation had spread across campus social media groups. By morning, local news stations had picked up the story. Local high school principal involved in racially charged incident at university. The Wilson family home, once a symbol of stability in their quiet suburban neighborhood, had become ground zero for a family in crisis. Anne sat at the kitchen table, her hands wrapped around a cold cup of coffee, watching as her husband paced back and forth. The call from the university's administration had been brief but clear. There would be an investigation, and the incident would be treated with the utmost seriousness. "What were you thinking?" Anne's voice was quiet but firm. "Our daughter. How could you do that to our daughter?" David stopped his pacing, looking at his wife as if seeing her for the first time. The anger that had fueled his actions had drained away, leaving behind a hollow feeling he couldn't quite name. "I was protecting her," he said, but the words sounded weak even to his own ears. Upstairs, Katie sat on her bed, scrolling through her social media feed. Her friends were sharing the video, not knowing it was her father, her family, at the center of the storm. She turned off her phone, buried her face in her pillow, and tried to block out the sound of her parents' voices drifting up from below. At the university, Michelle hadn't left her dorm room since the incident. Her roommate had brought her dinner, along with news that the video had gone viral. Anthony's face in the video, the shock and hurt in his eyes, was being shared across platforms with captions demanding justice and change. Anthony's family had driven up from Rhode Island as soon as they heard. His mother, Patricia, sat in his dorm room, holding an ice pack to his cheek, even though the redness had long since faded. "We should press charges," his older brother insisted, pacing the small room. But Anthony shook his head. "That's Michelle's father," he said quietly. "It would only hurt her more." The university's response came swiftly. A formal investigation was launched, and David was asked to stay away from campus. His own school board called an emergency meeting. The principal who had shaped young minds for 15 years was now facing suspension pending an investigation into his conduct. The local news vans parked outside the Wilson home didn't catch the moment Annie packed a small suitcase, took Katie by the hand, and drove to her sister's house. They didn't see David standing in the doorway, watching his family drive away, or the way his shoulders slumped as he closed the door on an empty house. Michelle's phone buzzed constantly with messages of support from classmates and strangers alike. But the ones that hurt the most were from her childhood friends, people who had known her father as the man who coached their soccer teams and chaperoned their school dances. "We had no idea," they wrote. "We're so sorry." Anthony threw himself into his studies, trying to maintain his perfect GPA despite the whispers that followed him around campus. His professors, aware of the situation, offered extensions on assignments, but he refused. "I won't let this define me," he told his mother over the phone. "I won't let it change my goals." The university's counseling center reached out to both students, offering support and resources. Michelle finally agreed to go, finding unexpected comfort in talking to someone who could help her navigate the complex emotions of loving both her father and the man he had hurt. Back at the Wilson home, David sat alone in his study, surrounded by family photos. There was Michelle at her high school graduation, beaming with pride as he handed her her diploma. Katie's first ballet recital, where he had cheered the loudest. the family vacation to the beach last summer before everything changed. He picked up a photo of himself with Michelle as a little girl, perched on his shoulders at a fair. When had he stopped seeing her as someone capable of making her own choices? The school board meeting was scheduled for the following week. David's colleagues, people he had worked with for years, would sit in judgment of his actions. The local paper had already run an editorial calling for his resignation. His phone was filled with missed calls from friends and fellow educators, some offering support, others expressing disappointment. Anne called every evening to check on him, her voice tired but determined. "You need help, David," she said. "Real help. Not just for your job, but for our family." She told him about Katie crying herself to sleep, about the college counselor who suggested family therapy. For the first time in his life, David listened without arguing. Michelle and Anthony tried to maintain some normalcy in their relationship, but the weight of what had happened hung between them. They held hands as they walked across campus, no longer hiding, but the stares and whispers followed them everywhere. Anthony's friends rallied around them, creating a protective circle of support, but Michelle couldn't help noticing how some people crossed to the other side of the walkway when they passed. One evening, as they sat in the library studying, Anthony reached across the table and took Michelle's hand. "Your father's actions don't define you," he said softly, "just like they don't define me." Michelle squeezed his hand, tears threatening to spill onto her textbook. The media coverage continued, with talking heads debating the broader implications of the incident. Some defended David as a concerned father, while others called for his immediate termination. Lost in the noise was the simple truth of two young people who had fallen in love, and a father who had let fear overshadow his love for his daughter. As the week drew to a close, David received an unexpected visitor. His old mentor, a retired professor who had guided him through his early years in education, showed up at his door. They sat in the kitchen, drinking coffee in silence before the older man finally spoke. "You've spent your career teaching young people to think for themselves," he said. "Maybe it's time to learn from them." The words hit David like a physical blow. As night fell over the quiet suburb, he sat alone in his daughter's room, looking at the life she had built, debate team trophies, honor roll certificates, and tucked in a corner, a small photo booth strip he had never noticed before, showing his daughter laughing with Anthony, their faces close together, radiating happiness. The aftermath of those few seconds in a dormitory hallway continued to ripple outward, touching lives and changing perspectives. But for the Wilson family, the real work was just beginning. The hard, necessary work of confronting long-held beliefs, rebuilding trust, and learning to love without conditions. The mandatory diversity and inclusion counseling sessions were held in a small office building downtown, far from both the university and the high school where David had once been principal. He sat in the waiting room, watching others like him, people who had let their prejudices hurt the ones they loved, flip through outdated magazines and avoid eye contact. His counselor, Dr. Reynolds, was a gentle-voiced woman with gray-streaked hair and eyes that seemed to look right through his defenses. In their first session, she asked him a simple question that stopped him in his tracks. "Tell me about the first time you realized people could be different from you." David found himself talking about his own father, about growing up in a small town where everyone looked the same, thought the same, lived the same. He talked about the first time he'd seen his daughter come home from kindergarten, excited about making a new friend who didn't look like her, and how he'd felt a flash of something he now recognized as fear. Fear of what? Dr. Reynolds had asked. The question haunted him through sleepless nights in his empty house. The silence where his family's voices should have been gave him too much time to think. He found himself walking through each room, looking at photos on the walls through new eyes. There was Michelle's first day of school, her tiny hand clutching his as she looked up at him with complete trust. When had he started betraying that trust? During group sessions, he met other parents struggling with their own journeys. There was a mother who had cut off contact with her son when he married someone from a different faith. A father who hadn't spoken to his daughter in 5 years because of who she chose to love. Their stories were different, but their pain, and their children's pain, was the same. One session particularly stuck with him. A man about his age, Robert, shared how he had missed his daughter's wedding because of his prejudices. "I thought I was protecting our family's values," Robert said, his voice breaking. "Instead, I lost the chance to walk my little girl down the aisle. Don't make my mistake, David. At home, David started doing something he'd never done before. He began to read books about civil rights history that he'd always dismissed as political. Stories about families like his, torn apart by prejudice and brought back together by love. He ordered them online, too ashamed to face the local bookstore clerk who had known him for years. Anne called regularly, updating him on Katie's life. His younger daughter had joined a diversity club at her school, inspired by recent events to make a difference in her own way. She's trying to understand, Anne told him. We all are. The most difficult part of his therapy was writing letters he knew he might never send. Dr. Reynolds had asked him to write to everyone affected by his actions. He wrote to Anthony first, spending hours trying to find words to apologize for judging him based on nothing but his appearance. He wrote to his colleagues at the school, acknowledging how his actions had betrayed everything they were supposed to teach their students. But the hardest letter was to Michelle. He started and restarted it dozens of times, filling his trash can with crumpled attempts to explain himself to his daughter. How could he tell her that his fear of losing her had caused him to act in a way that might make him lose her forever? One evening, as he sat at his desk struggling with another draft, he received an unexpected email. It was from one of his former students, now a college junior. The student wrote about how Mr. Wilson had once helped him stand up to bullies who were targeting him because of his accent. You taught me that everyone deserves respect, the student wrote. I hope you can remember that lesson now. The irony wasn't lost on David. How many times had he stood in front of school assemblies talking about respect, dignity, and the importance of looking beyond surface differences? How many times had he disciplined students for the very kind of behavior he had displayed? His breakthrough came during a particularly intense group session. A fellow participant asked him directly, "What are you more afraid of? That your daughter is dating someone different from you, or that she's grown into a woman strong enough to make her own choices?" The question hit him like a punch to the gut. That night, he couldn't sleep. He found himself in Michelle's room again, but this time he really looked at her books, her photos, her achievements. His daughter hadn't just succeeded academically. She had grown into a young woman with the courage to stand up for what she believed in, even when that meant standing up to him. He thought about Anthony, remembering how he had remained calm and dignified even in the face of violence. He thought about how, according to Anne, Anthony had refused to press charges, showing more concern for Michelle's feelings than for his own justified anger. The next morning, David did something he hadn't done in weeks. He drove to his old school. He didn't go inside, but sat in his car watching students arrive. They came in all shapes, sizes, and colors, laughing and talking together. He saw couples holding hands, friends sharing jokes, teachers greeting students. The scene he had witnessed hundreds of times before suddenly looked different through his new perspective. That afternoon, in Dr. Reynolds' office, David finally broke down. I was wrong, he said, tears streaming down his face. I've been wrong for so long. It wasn't just about that one moment in the dormitory hallway anymore. It was about a lifetime of fears and prejudices he had never questioned, never examined, never tried to change. Dr. Reynolds handed him a tissue and waited patiently as he collected himself. Recognition is the first step, she said quietly. The question is, what are you going to do with this awareness? As David drove home that evening, the sun setting behind him, he realized that the hard work of transformation was only beginning. But for the first time since that terrible day in the dormitory, he felt something close to hope. Not just for himself, but for his family, for the possibility of healing, and for the chance to become the father his daughter deserved. The small church stood quietly in the morning light, its stained glass windows casting colorful shadows across the empty parking lot. David sat in his car, hands gripping the steering wheel, watching as other cars began to arrive. He recognized Anthony's family's car from Michelle's description, a well-maintained blue sedan that Anthony's mother had bought after years of saving. This meeting had taken weeks to arrange. Dr. Reynolds had helped him draft the letter requesting it, and Anne had acted as intermediary, carefully navigating the delicate emotions of all involved. The church's community room had been chosen as neutral ground, a place where healing might begin. Inside, the room was simple but welcoming, with comfortable chairs arranged in a circle. Pastor Johnson, who had known Anthony's family for years, had offered to moderate the meeting. He stood at the door now, greeting each person with the same gentle warmth, creating an atmosphere of calm in the midst of tension. David watched as Anthony's family arrived, his mother Patricia, straight-backed and dignified, his older brother looking protective, and his younger sister, who couldn't be much older than Katie. Anthony himself came last, walking beside Michelle, their hands clasped together. David's heart clenched at the sight of his daughter, who he hadn't seen in person since that terrible day. Anne and Katie arrived moments later, Katie immediately running to hug her sister, while Annie took her place in the circle, leaving an empty chair between herself and David. The message was clear. They were here to support him, but he had to do this on his own. Pastor Johnson opened the meeting with a simple prayer for understanding and healing, then turned to David. "You asked for this meeting," he said gently. "The floor is yours." David had rehearsed this moment countless times, but now, facing the people he had hurt, all his carefully prepared words seemed inadequate. His hands trembled as he pulled a worn piece of paper from his pocket, the letter he had finally managed to write after weeks of therapy. His voice cracked, and he had to start again. "I spent my whole life thinking I knew what was right. I thought I was protecting my family, protecting my daughter. But 3 months ago, I did something unforgivable. I let fear and prejudice override everything I claimed to believe in about education, about respect, about human dignity." He turned to Anthony, forcing himself to meet the young man's steady gaze. "I judged you without knowing you. I saw only what my prejudiced mind wanted to see, not the person my daughter had come to love, not the dedicated student who tutors others in his spare time, not the young man who wants to be a doctor to help children. I saw only my own fears reflected back at me." Patricia's hand reached for her son's, her eyes never leaving David's face. The room was completely silent except for David's voice, which grew stronger as he continued. To Michelle, he turned to his daughter, seeing the tears in her eyes. "I betrayed your trust in the worst possible way. You found someone who makes you happy, who challenges you to grow, who supports your dreams. Instead of celebrating that, I let my prejudices poison one of the most important relationships in your life. I failed you as a father." Michelle wiped her eyes, leaning slightly into Anthony's shoulder. David felt the weight of every word as he continued. To Anthony's family, "I disrespected not just Anthony, but all of you. I brought violence into a place of learning, showed the worst kind of example to young people I was supposed to be leading. There's no excuse for my actions, no justification that could make what I did okay." Patricia spoke then, her voice firm but not unkind. "What's changed?" she asked. "Why should we believe this isn't just about saving your job or your reputation?" David nodded, acknowledging the fairness of her question. He reached into his jacket and pulled out a small notebook, his journal from therapy. "These past months have been the hardest of my life," he said. "Not because I lost my job or because people look at me differently now, but because for the first time I had to really look at myself, at beliefs I've carried my whole life without questioning them, at the harm those beliefs have caused." He opened the journal, showing pages filled with his handwriting. "I've been working with a counselor, attending group sessions with others who've let prejudice damage their families. I've been reading, learning, trying to understand how I could have been so wrong for so long." Anthony's brother spoke up, his voice tight with controlled anger. "Words are easy," he said. "How do we know this isn't just talk?" David reached into his bag and pulled out a folder. "These are letters," he said, "from my former students, teachers, parents in the community. When the video went viral, they wrote to me. Some were angry, some disappointed. But the ones that hurt the most were from students of color who said they had trusted me, looked up to me. I let them down. I let everyone down." He turned to Anthony again. "I know I have no right to ask for forgiveness. What I did was assault, plain and simple. You would have been justified in pressing charges. The fact that you didn't, that you thought first of how it would affect Michelle, that shows more character than I've ever demonstrated." Pastor Johnson leaned forward. "What are you hoping for from this meeting?" David took a deep breath. "I'm not asking for instant forgiveness or for everything to go back to normal. I know that's not possible. What I'm asking for is a chance to prove through actions, not just words, that I can change, that I want to change, that I'm willing to do the work necessary to earn back even a fraction of the trust I've broken. He looked around the circle, at his family and at Anthony's. I'm asking for a chance to learn from all of you, to understand your experiences, your perspectives, to become the kind of father, the kind of person who deserves to be part of his daughter's life. The silence that followed was heavy with unspoken emotions. Michelle was the first to break it, her voice quiet but clear. "Dad," she said, "do you remember what you always told me when I was little? That the bravest thing isn't never being scared, but doing the right thing even when you are scared." David nodded, unable to speak. "That's what I did when I fell in love with Anthony," she continued. "I was scared of your reaction, but I knew what I felt was right. Now it's your turn to be brave, to face your fears and do what's right." Anthony squeezed Michelle's hand, then looked at David. "Sir," he said, his voice steady, "I love your daughter. That hasn't changed, despite everything. If you're truly willing to change, to learn, to grow, I'm willing to give you that chance. Not for your sake, but for Michelle's." Patricia nodded slowly. "We're people of faith," she said. "We believe in redemption, but trust has to be earned." As the meeting continued, plans were made. Small steps toward rebuilding what had been broken. A shared meal once a month, regular family counseling sessions, a commitment to open, honest communication. It wasn't forgiveness, not yet, but it was a beginning. A chance to transform a moment of hatred into a journey toward understanding. As they left the church that day, the morning sun now high in the sky, David knew the hardest work still lay ahead. But for the first time in months, he felt the weight of hope alongside the burden of his guilt. 1 year had passed since that life-changing day in the dormitory hallway. The university campus was alive with the excitement of graduation day, proud families streaming into the grand auditorium, clutching programs and flowers. David stood in the crowd, adjusting his tie nervously as Anne straightened Katie's dress. The past year had been a journey of small steps, painful conversations, and gradual healing. David had found a new purpose, speaking at local schools about his transformation from a man blinded by prejudice to someone learning to see the world through new eyes. His story, painful as it was, had become a powerful teaching tool. The monthly family dinners, which had started awkwardly in the church basement, had slowly moved to their homes. The first time Anthony came to the Wilson house for dinner, David had spent hours in the kitchen, attempting to cook his daughter's boyfriend's favorite dishes from a recipe Patricia had kindly shared. The food hadn't turned out perfect, but the effort meant everything. Michelle and Anthony had thrived despite the challenges. Their relationship, tested by fire, had grown stronger. Anthony's stellar academic performance had earned him early acceptance into medical school, while Michelle's passionate advocacy for social justice had led to an internship with a prestigious law firm. As families took their seats in the auditorium, David noticed how naturally Katie chatted with Anthony's younger sister. The two girls had bonded over their shared love of music, even starting a small diversity club at Katie's school. It was a reminder that change rippled outward, touching lives in unexpected ways. Patricia waved them over to where she had saved seats. The two families sat together now, no longer divided by the invisible barriers of prejudice. David remembered the first time he'd visited Anthony's home for dinner, how nervous he'd been, how warmly Patricia had welcomed him despite everything. "We all deserve a chance to grow," she'd said, serving him a plate of her famous lasagna. The ceremony began, and David felt Anne's hand slip into his as they watched the graduates file in. Michelle and Anthony sat a few rows apart, but their quick glances at each other spoke volumes about their connection. David remembered their graduation rehearsal dinner the night before, how Anthony had stood to make a toast. "A year ago, I thought I knew what strength meant," Anthony had said, looking around the table. But watching two families learn to overcome their differences, seeing love triumph over fear, that's taught me more than any textbook ever could. As the names were called, David felt tears welling up in his eyes. This wasn't just his daughter's graduation, it was a milestone in their family's journey. When Michelle's name was announced, he stood alongside Anthony's family, all of them cheering together. Minutes later, they did the same for Anthony, David's voice joining the chorus of celebration. After the ceremony, amid the chaos of photos and hugs, David watched his daughter with pride. She stood confident and tall, her graduation robe draped over the dress Anne had helped her choose. Anthony approached with his family, his own robe slightly askew, his face beaming with accomplishment. The moment the families gathered for photos could have been awkward, but instead felt natural. David found himself standing next to Anthony, no trace of the tension that had once divided them. As the photographer counted down, David leaned slightly toward the young man who had helped change his life. "Thank you," he whispered, "for not giving up on us." Anthony's smile deepened. "Family is worth fighting for," he replied quietly. Later, at the celebration dinner at Patricia's house, David stood to make a speech. The backyard was decorated with lights, tables filled with a mixture of both families' favorite foods. Looking around at the faces of people who had moved from strangers to family, he felt overwhelmed with gratitude. "A year ago," he began, his voice steady, "I stood for everything that was wrong in this world. I let fear and ignorance guide my actions. But thanks to the incredible strength and forgiveness of two remarkable young people, I learned that it's never too late to change." He turned to his daughter and Anthony. "You two didn't just graduate today. You taught all of us a profound lesson about love, courage, and the power of standing up for what's right. Michelle, honey, you showed me what real strength looks like. And Anthony," he paused, emotion thick in his voice, "you've become the son I never knew I needed." Katie jumped up to hug her father as he finished speaking, followed by Michelle. Soon both families were embracing, tears and laughter mixing together under the warm evening sky. The scene would have been unimaginable a year ago, but now it felt like the most natural thing in the world. As the evening wound down, David found himself sitting quietly with Patricia, watching their children laugh together over dessert. "We did good," she said softly, patting his hand. "Not perfect, but good." He nodded, understanding the weight of her words. The journey wasn't over. There would always be more to learn, more ways to grow. But looking at the love and joy surrounding him, David knew that the hardest step had been taken, admitting he was wrong and choosing to change. Michelle and Anthony's story had started as a tale of prejudice and pain, but it had transformed into something more powerful. A testament to the human capacity for change, the strength of love over fear, and the possibility of healing even the deepest wounds. As the stars began to appear in the evening sky, their families united in celebration, it was clear that sometimes the most beautiful endings come from the most difficult beginnings. The video that had once brought shame now served as a powerful teaching tool in David's presentations, a reminder that it's never too late to choose love over hate, understanding over ignorance, and growth over stagnation. Their story had become a beacon of hope for other families struggling with similar challenges, proving that with courage, compassion, and commitment to change, even the deepest divides could be bridged.